And Les Havens was my friend. It's a privilege to share in honoring him with you all today. But I admit that I have been humbled and anxious in the face of my task to talk about Les and his work as a therapist, because it is like trying to describe some shining, brilliant light. For years to come, his work will be studied and shared by far greater minds than mine, and with that endeavor, his legacy will likely grow and continue to shine. But I think that Les would have said that therapy is a friendly business. He surely approached it with the warmth and devotion that I knew him to bring to friendship. He was my friend for 40 years, most of my life. There were moments along that way when, after some stunning encounter or other, I would think to myself that perhaps Les knew me better than I knew myself. But thinking that way was a disservice to his intention. What he was really evoking was a sort of introduction to oneself, to one's own wisdom and inner experience. In effect, he would be calling one home to one's own awareness. I do believe that Les Havens was the most empowering person I've ever known. Perhaps the seed of this was in his nature, a gift. But when he became a devoted scholar of the human condition, that gift was nurtured into an extraordinary talent. Les had an enormous respect for the innovators in the world of psychiatry. He could hold forth spontaneously and like no other on the influence of Freud, Jung, Sullivan, Kohut, and others. But it was he who took their clear notes, the sharps, the flats, and composed them into a symphony of skill that he brought to his own work. Les opened the metaphorical door to his office to me when I was very young and new in the business of being a therapist. He would refer to me some of his own patients, and we would work with them together. Like so many of you, my work today is in many ways an homage to his generosity. He once said that he thought of every interview as providing an opportunity for something helpful to happen. As therapists, he would say, we have to speak for the patient's suffering. We have to size up their particular difficulties, embrace the mysteries, find the darkness, and bring some zest to the experience of bearing it, sorting it, and making sense. He said, you occupy the ground of their concern more voluminously than they do, than they know you know. Our patients need to be comforted by our presence, while at the same time disconcerted. And this great man himself lived and worked by those words. Lucky was a concept that I remember Les having liked. Some of us were lucky in this life, some of us not. But he did not allow this notion to compromise his momentum in the business of empowering his patients, speaking directly to their power. If you were unlucky, you could not find a better embrace than that of this man. But if you were lucky and lived some version of yourself as unlucky, he would call you out. He would say something like, I hope you're not going to go around finding even more people to abuse you. You know, there are lots of them around. You can find them. Or, how are we going to get this stuff out of your head? Or, one I'm sure was probably pretty frequent in his repertoire, what, don't you know what you're like? When I think of Les in the proverbial chair, this is what I remember, his ease. He always said that the therapist had to be comfortable in order to seek souls. His laugh, that twinkle, his listening, I believe he paid attention like no other. His subtlety, his power could be unspeakably quiet. Truth, He always told the truth. He answered patients' questions, not with a question, but with an answer. Respect. He was flawlessly respectful. With that, his patients were invited to take responsibility without shame. That is a tall order and a great skill. Courage. I think he was fearless. He evoked a feeling that he could hear and bear anything. His strength, one felt, was for sharing. And patience. Patience is an act of faith, after all. I think Les could abide with such remarkable patience in his work because he so very deeply believed in a healing outcome. With his hallmark generosity, Les has left us a profound legacy in the understanding of psychotherapy and its power to make different and better the lives of so many. Perhaps it is now our mandate to hold him in our hearts and pay him forward as we live and work. For his presence, his gifts, and his touching us all in one way or another, we are, well, after all, very, very lucky.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas, and I'm Leston Haven's eldest grandson. I'm going to read to you today a poem he wrote to me on my christening in August 1993. Like your father and mother, there may be nothing you cannot do. Already, the Great Spirit moves your little arms and legs, and your mind goes out with those eager hands to grasp the world. You are not casually amused. No careless thoughts preoccupy that grave brow. No, you are serious without being solemn, and involved, not merely occupied. I wonder what you will make of the world, the perplexing world, with its silences and ambiguities. I predict a light, a bright, clear light, shining from you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dominic, the second grandson, and this was written for me just before my first birthday, August 1995. Young man, so solid with good humor and comfort, will you cheer all the serious ones up, your grandfather too, and match Nicholas's clear light with a laughing beam beside it to show the balance of life, that nothing is quite what it seems.
Hello, I'm Benjamin Sandu, the youngest grandson, and this is a poem that he wrote me on my 4th birthday in 2001. And young man, so settled, so steady, like your father. Do you really see with clear eyes? Did you from the beginning grasp the essential impatience of humanity? It is possible. I envy that. I look on you with astonishment that people could be born into a world they understand. Often I think your mother is like that. Time will test you, and your brothers too, but it is possible your good sense will prevail. Then we will all learn. Thank you.
I'm Jennifer Havens, Les's oldest daughter. I just want to know, all the shrinks in the room, I have you beat. When I was in my early 20s, before I went to medical school, living in Boston, I started reading Les's works. I think I've read them all, at least once. I worked close enough to Mass Mental to go visit him when he was there as the training director, and several times watched him do his miraculous interviews with the very challenging patients his trainees would present to him. You've heard a lot about the impact he's had on generations of psychiatrists. As I moved into my own psychiatric training at Cornell in New York City in the 80s, I realized I had absorbed a kind of protective clarity about what was at the core of the work. As Les so often pointed out, our field is young and sometimes muddled, torn between the biological and the psychological, without clear tests of normality or health. How we approach the patient often gets lost in trying to nail down the problem and fix it. In his erudite and technically detailed way, Les taught me and many, many other people what was at the heart of the work, finding another person and bringing them to safety. I believe this is the source of his extraordinary influence on the field. He kept us all in touch with the soul of psychiatry. Now let me talk about Les as a father. Les loved his family. He loved his children deeply. And when Les loved you, he loved you with a strong and deep pride and a ferocious loyalty. I want to tell a couple of stories. When I defended my honors thesis in psychology at Smith, Les came to visit me. He would often come to visit me at Smith, and being the quintessential WASP, he would wait till the chicken salad with grapes was on the menu and drive out to Northampton. This time, however, unfortunately, there was a picnic because it was graduation week. And as the faculty of the Department of Psychology came in to hear my oral defense, one of them had the audacity to actually bring food and sit down and eat it. I had to hold Les back. Another story, and I have permission to tell this story. When my ex-husband and I, Peter, who is here, split up, Les absolutely refused to talk to Peter. I begged with him, I pleaded with him. Les was a very important person in Peter's life. They'd worked together, written papers together. He said, "Absolutely not. I'm with you." When I left Columbia after many years and went to Bellevue to run child psychiatry, which is where I am now, my father was bursting with pride. He said, "You are going to one of the great, great places in American psychiatry. And it's the only place, Jen, I regret never having worked." And he was just beaming. Now, for all of Les's wonderful qualities, I know I speak for myself and my siblings when I say sometimes Les could be a little much. He was always, always trying to be helpful, as you've heard from other people, even when you didn't want him to. In the end of his life, something happened, which was a great gift to all of us who loved him so much. As he gradually lost his cognitive capacities, he lost his ability to control every single interaction he ever had with anyone. Something emerged. There was this sweet, open man who just wanted the people he loved around him. Behind that amazing intellectual force, behind that incisive, probing soul, was a man just overflowing with love. Daddy, we're comforted by the fact that you're with Jeffrey now, but we will all miss you terribly.
My name is Bob Michaels. I'm a psychiatrist in New York City. Following his undergraduate work at Williams, Les went to Cornell Medical College. He graduated in 1952 and spent 2 years as a medicine intern and resident there afterwards, before settling at Harvard for the rest of his career. I got to Cornell in 1974, a bit later, and was dean of the medical school that Les graduated in the 90s. We had regular correspondence when I was dean. I wrote him each year asking for a donation and wrote him each year thanking him for his donation. However, I'd met him 10 years after he left Cornell in 1964. I remember it vividly. I had not heard of him before, or he of me, I'm sure, but he was my examiner when I first sat for my psychiatry boards. He introduced himself. It seemed like he was trying to allay my anxiety and assuring me about what was about to happen, and I was too anxious to pick up the slight element of perhaps a little bit of hyperbole that we all know familiarly with his style. He told me that he would show me into a room in which there would be a pad of paper and a pencil and a desk that I was free to use and a patient that I was to interview, and tried to put me at ease. If I wanted to, I could take notes, he said. He then showed me into the room, and there was indeed 2 chairs, a desk, a pad of paper, a pencil, and a young, frazzled girl sitting on the floor near the radiator with her head toward the wall. I was a little scared. She looked catatonic, and was. Les was watching me closely. He wanted to see what I would do. In the next 10 seconds, I made a quick decision. I ignored the chairs, the desk, the pad of paper, the pencil, and I walked over and sat next to her on the floor. I said, "You look like you're frightened." "I'm frightened too." I think I passed that second with Les. It might have taken a while before I passed the boards. He asked me lots of questions. I gave him lots of answers. Both of us knew how to do that, and both did it well. But the key thing was I made contact with the girl, and in the process with Les. We began a lifelong friendship and correspondence that continued for decades. In 1976, I wrote a review of his book, Participant Observation. I said then, Havens envisions a psychotherapy that is thoughtfully pluralistic rather than arbitrarily eclectic, with each of the schools seen as offering methods of specific value. I can't imagine Les ever liking the word eclectic. Eclectic means embracing the lowest common denominator. Les embraced the highest possible denominator. He was a master at each rather than someone who combined many. In 1980, he decided to take a sabbatical year at Yale, although he actually never did so. And he sought a grant from the Foundation Fund for Research in Psychiatry. It was 1980, and he was seeking $20,000, the good old days. He asked me to write, and I wrote a letter to Fritz Redlich, then president of the fund. I quote, "Dr. Havens is an unusually gifted teacher of clinical psychiatry, a central figure in the education of generations of Harvard medical students, psychiatry residents, and others who trained at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. He has a special ability to communicate the richness and excitement of the clinical context and to stimulate students who become aware of their own role in it. His writing about the major schools of clinical work has helped to develop the beginnings of a comparative psychiatry, the delineation of the special features of each of the major approaches, along with the essential categories that generate these unique characteristics. Together with this, he has provided some of the clearest expositions in print of the various schools of psychotherapy. His more recent work has concerned the specification of what is actually done in these different schools, the words they use, the questions they ask, the implicit and explicit models that they employ. Dr. Havens' work has not been regarded simply as within any of the particular schools of psychotherapy, but as cutting across them. It's more of a contribution to our understanding of their mutual relationships than to the development of any particular theory. It's a contribution to the comparative sociology and comparative anthropology of psychotherapy, as well as to psychotherapy itself. Les and I met regularly through the years, often around the country. I lived in New York, he in Boston, but I became an examiner in the boards in which he examined me, and we'd meet at board exams. We'd be on scientific programs together at annual meetings. I remember first meeting Susan, if my memory's right, at a dinner in Portland, Oregon, many years ago. But that's another story. He was a master at studying and describing what therapists do, what they actually say, how they sit, where they look, what they must believe in order to do that kind of thing, rather than the much more popular and easier, but much less important, what they assert their theories to be. Therapists often don't know what their theories really are. He was an extraordinary clinician and teacher. He could see the world through his patient's or student's eyes, and then seduce the patient or student to see it through his eyes. He was extraordinarily seductive, as those of you know who've lived or worked or studied with him. He could pull the student or patient in and not only get them to see the world through his eyes, but when he then shifted his gaze, he could get them to shift with him. We have lost a master.
Good afternoon. My name is Alyssa Kleinman. Les was a beloved and generous mentor for many years, and I have the honor today to present Susan Miller Haven's remarks. Did you know? You may not know that Les was admitted to Yale Law School in order to follow in his father's and uncle's footsteps as New York lawyers. However, the family didn't know he wanted to be a Clarence Darrow representing the underdog, not corporations. Later, he would manifest this passion in his defense of patients against all sorts of life situations and systems. Les loved figuring out strategies. Playing chess and knowing the battle plans for World War II were second nature to him. Did anyone know that he left Williams to join the army in order to kill Hitler? Les learned Japanese and ended up in the South Pacific on the island of Tinian, blowing up ammunition. He taught Shakespeare in an army hospital. One day the class had to be interrupted for surgeons to operate. It was then that he became fascinated with medicine. After the war, he was admitted to Cornell Medical School, where he did a residency in internal medicine to prepare himself for studying the relationship between mind and body. It was with dread that he recalled walking down to the hospital where his own father was dying to tell him he had decided to become a physician, only worse, a psychiatrist. Maybe you don't know that many of Les's awards were for biological research. As a young psychiatrist at Mass Mental in 1955, Les's first award was not for a psychological discovery. It was for diagnosing a patient as suffering from liver disease and elevated blood ammonia. Everyone thought the patient was just plain psychotic, but Les proved that the liver was the culprit. Les studied the relationship of goosebumps to ECT outcome. He wrote a paper on hallucinations in outer space with the Australian anthropologist John Cott. Les kept most of his awards and trophies in a box because he did not want the children to think that they were something to aim for. He only hung his Elvin Semrad Teaching Award. In 1965, in an unprecedented bow to psychiatry, Les was published in the New England Journal of Medicine and invited by the Mass General to deliver his now pivotal paper, An Anatomy of a Suicide, at Grand Rounds. After the speech in the parking lot, the great cardiologist, Paul Dudley White, ran up behind him saying, "Dr. Havens, don't you think if Marilyn Monroe had exercised, she would not have been depressed?" Forever interested in the biological, neurological, he noticed, when he first became ill, that his brain was misfiring in some way that he could not put his finger on. As his vascular disease progressed, he did his best to track it. Although it seemed like a cruel illness for him to have, the irony is that his mind actually got out of the way, so his heart became even more available to all of us. He was able, towards the end of his life, to receive and trust the love that was offered to him in truly wonderful ways. Remember the TV series Northern Exposure? Lester Hayes, the wise Indian chief, in scripts written by Dartmouth medical students, was based on Les. What would he think of Skype therapy? Les believed that astrology was an early psychological tool that was accurate. He was a Leo, and yes, he could roar, but then it was over quickly as if nothing had happened. What about when he worked in the coroner's office in Southampton one summer when he was a med student? He watched as the pathologist wrote down, cause of death, stroke. Les, holding a bullet, noting that the deceased had a clear bullet wound in one temple and out the other, questioned the report. The pathologist responded, "Son, this is just the way it is done here. Clearly, it's a stroke." When he became a professor, he had a letter from the headmaster at the Hotchkiss School saying that the demerit he had received for putting an apple on his windowsill had been removed from his record. He loved Williams College and was a Yankee fan most of his life, but would not respond to George Steinbrenner's request for alumni donations because there was something about George that made him uneasy. Les believed that the rich and famous often got the worst care. The sight of the baseball great Lou Gehrig on the streets of New York had a lasting effect on him. Now a skeleton wearing a huge camel hair coat, this once tall, powerful athlete had found no one to cure him. Les was the youngest person to be nominated to be Commissioner of Mental Health. He didn't want to be an administrator, so he sabotaged the interview over breakfast with Governor and Mrs. Volpe. When Volpe asked what his goal was for mental health in Massachusetts, he said to open all the hospitals and let everyone out. He did not get the job. If Les were here right now, he would leave. To something he did not feel like talking about, he would comment, "How interesting." In a huge drawer, Les kept every piece of correspondence that his children Chris, Jeff, Jenny, Sarah, and Emily ever wrote him. Les was more drawn to philosophy than religion per se, but there were times when Les would say the only thing left to do in a situation was to pray. To complaints made about an impossible person, his response was, "We are all God's children," or during the reign of the Boston Strangler, "I am sure he came by it honestly." I would hear him on the phone over the last 3 decades saying to an enormous variety of people, "Well then, let's take a walk around the river." Les never revealed what went on between him and whomever he was walking around the river with. For some, he did not want their privacy to be violated by being seen walking into his office. For others, he simply wanted to walk side by side. I did sense that hundreds of debates were had, decisions were made, and worries quelled. I would like to end by giving you all a message from Les in the form of 2 passages from his writings. Over and over again, I have found that those who claimed to make it alone had behind them parents or friends whose adoring voices were firmly planted in their heads. And those who do not have adoring voices too often hear critical ones, stopping them cold in their tracks. As to despair, I want you to know that despair is best spoken, best shared, that it is best divided and apportioned between yourself and someone to be trusted, because no one does anything important alone. You see, Les wanted us to replace the critical voices in our heads, to be the adoring voice for someone else, and never to go it alone. He encouraged us to set our goals a bit beyond ourselves, and he wanted so much for all of us of every age to be free to escape into our daydreams, to be free to escape from all psychological imprisonment, and most of all, to be free to love and receive love. Thank you.
Les's family invites all of you to join them for a reception at the Harvard Faculty Club following this celebration. And then would everyone please rise and join in singing the recessional, "When the Saints Come Marching In." Those lyrics are also on the sheet in your program.
Okay. So I did it. Is everybody